This UHEC Stories from Storage episode is about this newspaper clipping from the New York Sunday News issue of November 19th, 1933. The headline is Red Meets White, 6,400 Russians Riot. And it's about a protest march by 6,000 costumed white Russians from the Ukraine, quote unquote, the 400-odd communist counter-protesters who showed up to meet them, and the occasionally violent clashes that happened between some of the individuals in the two groups. This article is definitely in the time-honored journalistic tradition of if it bleeds, it leads. It's almost entirely about the violence, with catchy sensationalistic phrases like bigger, better rioters, and when red meets white, they both turn black and blue. But if you were an average American newspaper reader in 1933, wondering who these people were and what their reasons were for protesting, you wouldn't get very much. Maybe we shouldn't be surprised. The article was probably written by some city beat reporter who was assigned to cover a riot. In fact, the article is completely preposterous, starting with that crazy oxymoron about costumed white Russians from the Ukraine. Sure, the term Russian was pretty routinely and erroneously used as a synonym for Soviet, what used to be the Russian Empire. But white Russians from the Ukraine is especially galling. I guess the reporter assumed that if the Reds were counter-protesting, then these must be the whites, as in the two main opposing factions in the Russian Civil War. But this is downright bizarre and even offensive, because a major fraction of the Russian whites believed in a Russia one and indivisible, and they would have considered Ukraine to be an absolutely essential part of that indivisible Russia. In fact, the whites' political and military leader Anton Denikin used that phrase, Russia one and indivisible, as his personal motto. His armies would fight not only the Reds, but also the forces of the independent Ukrainian People's Republic, one of many who were attacking that fledgling state. If all of this sounds eerily familiar, you're not imagining things. It is absolutely not a coincidence that Vladimir Putin is quite an admirer of Denikin, especially of Denikin's attitude towards Ukraine, namely that Ukraine is an inalienable part of Russia. In fact, it was likely at Putin's behest that Denikin's remains were moved from their previous not-so-final resting place in Jackson, New Jersey, to the Donskoy Monastery in Moscow in 2005. So calling these Ukrainian protesters whites was really crazy. But what were they protesting? The article does start out with the line, United States recognition of Soviet Russia was the cause of bloody, bottle-throwing, head-smashing, 2-hour battle in Manhattan streets, which makes it sound like it was a purely political protest. Quite a bit lower down, on another page actually, there's also a subheading titled Banners Charge Starvation, in scare quotes of course, but below that there's just one paragraph that describes the protesters' floats. There is not even a slightest attempt to understand the origin or the merits of this charge of starvation before going right back to the rioting. To really find out what this protest was about, we have to go to the Ukrainian language press at the time. As we can see in newspapers like Svoboda, the Ukrainian diaspora in the United States in 1932 and 1933 had been doing everything it could to make the famine in Ukraine, what would later be called the Holodomor, more widely known to the general public. By the fall of 1933, however, Ukrainian Americans had linked advocacy about the famine to the Roosevelt administration's efforts to establish diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. Roosevelt's readiness to overturn diplomatic precedent just at the moment that Soviet Ukraine was suffering a massive artificial famine struck Ukrainian Americans as, at best, incredibly bad timing. So they expanded their advocacy to include lobbying the American government against diplomatic recognition of the Soviet Union. On November 13, 1933, readers of Svoboda would have seen this announcement on page 3. It reads, "To the fight for existence. If the Moscow Bolsheviks starve out the Ukrainian nation in Europe, then we will not survive here. There will be no Ukraine and no Ukrainian people. This should be understood by every American Ukrainian and every American of Ukrainian descent when they are called to join the protest march to New York on Saturday, November 18th at 10 o'clock a.m. The march will start from Washington Square and will end in a great mass rally at the Central Opera House on East 67th Street. Ukrainian men and women, drop your work for one day and go help your kindred who are in the claws of the bloodthirsty Bolshevik vampire. Don't cry and complain, but give a proper response to the local Bolshevik thugs who want to intimidate you, a free American citizen, with fire from communist hell. Remember that the day of judgment is coming for the Bolshevik criminals. Signed, the Committee for the Protest March in New York. The result was the very march that the Sunday News would report on the next day. It's interesting that the anti-Bolshevik stance of the organizers of the protest was not completely political or ideological. It was based on what they felt was an existential threat to Ukrainians as a people. Today we'd call that genocide, but that term hadn't been invented yet. It's also clear that even though they were here in the United States, they felt themselves to be an intrinsic part of that threatened group. And so they believed that this genocidal threat applied to themselves as well, if only indirectly. It's also interesting, and maybe even a bit ironic, that the vast majority of these Ukrainians who participated in the protest were in fact from Western Ukraine, which was not part of the Soviet Union at the time, and where there was no famine. Like I said earlier, we probably shouldn't expect too much in the way of historical or geopolitical insights in an article from a City Beat reporter. But it says a lot that the Sunday News made no attempt to seriously cover why these quote-unquote white Russians from the Ukraine were protesting. They certainly didn't do it here, and they didn't do it in any other article to the best of our knowledge. It's a really vivid example of the kind of uphill battle that Ukrainian Americans would be fighting for many decades to come.